Is Gen AI going to automate hacking, going to end the world, right? Going to make it impossible for us to do our jobs?
Welcome to the GenAI Security Project Threat Intelligence Podcast Series, Episode 4.
You need an extraordinary amount of malicious attack data that's well labeled.
Where expert hosts Rachel James and Dr. Brian Nakayama, co-leads from the GenAI Security Project Threat Intelligence Initiative, share the latest and greatest on AI threat intelligence. The opinions expressed in this podcast are theirs and theirs alone and do not reflect the opinions of the organizations through which they are employed. Welcome back to the Threat Intelligence Podcast. We are on Episode 4. We're back with Rachel James and Brian Nakayama. Welcome, guys. Welcome to the show. And so we're going to launch right into it. Look, everybody's been telling me for 2 years that AI is about to turn every basement script kiddie into a nation state operator. Is that actually happening?
Hey, that's a good question. I think one of the biggest questions facing threat intelligence professionals, blue teams, security professionals everywhere is Gen AI going to automate hacking, going to end the world, right? Going to make it impossible for us to do our jobs. And so there's a really great new paper that was recently released called Standalone Complex or Cybercrime by Hughes, Collier, and Thomas. You can find it on Archive, and we'll be sure to include a link to it as well. But the great thing about this paper is that, I think in the first instance, we talk about this a lot at the CTI initiative, is the fact that it's very hard to observe what threat actors are doing with generative AI, right? This depends on basically companies like OpenAI or Anthropic doing disclosures. Okay, here's what we observed, that sort of thing, or even self-reported, kind of malware teams going through and noticing, hey, there's a lot of emojis in here. So, something that's really nice about this paper is that it's very empirically grounded, right? And insofar as it draws on a data set from various criminal bulletin boards or, kind of discussion forums, and so it tries to actually ask the question, okay, how are threat actors actually talking about how they're using AI tools, right? Instead of like a lot of threat intelligence write-ups just kind of assert it's going to automate hacking, it's going to change everything, or they'll take one limited instance and extrapolate it out to describe every single actor. And so this gives us a really interesting look into both, how criminals are using it, particularly kind of low tier criminals, but also how that kind of conversation has evolved, what they've identified as the uses and benefits, things like that. And so it's really just the most empirically grounded writing that we've actually seen on, okay, what is generative AI doing to impact the skill levels of criminal actors?
If more professional, more skilled coders are having access to this, it sounds kind of like it's a movie in terms of what's happening with people being able to hack into. I've been watching a lot of James Bond lately. Is this something that we're leading towards where everybody's going to be able to get into it to be able to hack into these larger organizations as more skilled people come online and as AI develops more?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. So in the paper, they kind of develop, kind of like a super sci-fi scenario, and a kind of like more kind of common, less interesting, but still skill uplift scenario. And so they call those like two extremes: Standalone Complex, which is inspired by the movie Ghost in the Shell, which is a very famous kind of anime series, as well as cybercrime, right? Which is also really kind of fun, kind of neologism that they coined. So the Standalone Complex is basically that that maximalist scenario. Someone's going to create hacking bot 9000. It's going to go out. It's going to lay waste to all companies, right? The world is going to end. Everyone's going to lose their money, that sort of thing. So basically this idea that actors are able to use generative AI to create this highly complicated, highly effective method for basically automating crime, right? So then the other is cybercrime, which is basically saying similar to vibe coding, criminals basically are just able to use generative AI tools to just kind of do some basic uplift. They automate some tasks, et cetera, et cetera. And so, between these two polls, okay, what do they find in their research, right? Looking at tens of thousands of forum threads, diving through, hundreds of thousands of lines of text from these, kind of criminal forums, is that neither is materializing. You neither have vibe crimers, nor do you have the standalone complex where people are able to automate huge swaths of criminal activity. Rather, they're seeing that basically Gen AI and its ability to automate is helping to automate already automated work, right? Things like, search engine optimization, content farms, doing romance scans, doing social media bots, right? Like, posting harassing images, that sort of thing. So it's interesting. It does this very low level work very well. And it's not actually doing either of those kind of like super, strong scenarios where we're going to see massive changes to the threat landscape, right? Um, I think they have a really good quote in here. They say that, a lot of Gen AI adoption is happening in quote unquote low profit passive income schemes and trivial forms of fraud, right? And what's notably absent here is you don't see, one of these big fears that it's creating undetectable malware. It's creating entirely new vulnerability classes, or it's, automating the ability for one click, someone can go out there and buy the ability to hack a mega corporation, right? Is that we're not seeing these kinds of most extreme cases. And again, we're just seeing, automation of kind of low level, less interesting, things like producing an image to harass someone, helping to create like crafting messages to lure someone into a romance scam.
So as much as those things are irritating and annoying, it strikes me as that this is a little bit of a comfort in that you're saying it's not coming to fruition, the paranoia that has been around AI taking over the world, wreaking havoc, being, the new big bad boy on the block, or bad group on the block. You're saying that at this particular moment that that's not actually happening. And what about looking in the future? Is it if you had a crystal ball, would you be able to tell whether this is something we can anticipate that it's going to happen on a large scale quickly, or is going to take a longer term, or what are you getting?
I think that's a really great question. And, I think we need to kind of, so I think the biggest thing to me, right, is that the accessibility of LM, or the accessibility of inference to criminals, right? And so one of the most interesting parts of this paper is that they looked at things like dark LLMs, right? The ability to create your own large language model, which is, extra good at hacking, extra good at writing malware. And the thing that they found repeatedly with things like WormGPT, et cetera, is that these are just wrappers for ChatGPT, right? And that moreover, if you wanted to create a dark LLM, if you're going to become like a super hacker and develop that in the future, you need mountains and mountains of data, right? Think about the fact that Claude, ChatGPT, these are trained on basically the entire internet, right? So you need a lot of very high quality data to be able to do that, right? So trying to think forward to the future is going to be thinking about tokenomics, the accessibility of inference to criminals. And it's discovered, that these authors found that they spend a ton of time on these forums trying to figure out how to get access to legitimate services, jailbreak them for, creating like a romance scam like message, that sort of thing, right? So I don't think I have a perfect crystal ball, but I feel like, we're going to continue to see these marginal improvements, right? And there's going to be real questions as, basically the token subsidy ends, which is to say that a lot of the costs of AI have been subsidized by investors, right? Will people start realizing, hey, that API key, which I've been barely using, suddenly is racking up tens of thousands of dollars worth of billings, and that might actually impact that market, right? So I realize that isn't really an answer, but I think it's a really big question of how accessible does high, capability LLMs become to criminal actors, and then moreover, can they effectively use them, right? And the answer at this moment seems to be they can't particularly effectively use them. You're not having like, someone completely new coming to the forum and like, doing this. But, Rachel's going to talk a little bit more about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, it might not be an answer per se in terms of nobody has a crystal ball, but you have clarified several things. So if you've got, what is it, the cybercrime? I mean, great phrasing. So if people aren't able to do this, aren't able to maliciously attack large organizations or even average size organizations, if there's some guardrails that are put up, it would strike me as. So if AI isn't turning skids into nation states and dark AI is mostly a scam, who is Gen AI actually helping in this ecosystem? And I'll hand that off to you, Rachel.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Brian brings up about the dark LLMs is a really important point, because I hear this a lot of people sort of hypothesizing that there must be some development of an AI, some hacker group who's engaging and developing a custom AI. It's really hard for us to observe that, right? Because that is probably being done in a way on local machines that none of the companies that we have mentioned would have visibility to. The other reason that that would be really difficult is when Brian says that you need an extraordinary amount of data, you need an extraordinary amount of malicious attack data that's well labeled. And what do we mean by well labeled? Well, if you're trying to train a model on, hey, design attacks for me that are successful, and here are ways that attacks are not successful and don't do these things, you would need to have a mountain of data about attacks and malicious code and offensive activity that's labeled. And most organizations, most threat actor organizations don't have the amount of data that would be necessary, nor do they have the means to label it appropriately. And the organizations that would have that amount of data, well, they have that amount of data because they've been extremely successful with those types of attacks without using AI. That's why they would have that kind of data. So what we are seeing when we look at Anthropic's threat intelligence reports about the weaponization of AI, we look at Google, we look at Microsoft, what we're seeing is basically most threat actors are using AI, generative AI, the same way most of us are using as sort of personal capability uplift, right? That the most capable actors who might have the most data to do something, particularly innovative with it, probably actually don't need AI to do those pieces anyway, right? So we're seeing things as like coding assistants that are already sort of productivity multipliers for already skilled actors, right? Faster lookup, the same way that, maybe Stack Overflow or cheat sheets did for the same community years ago. So, the important part about this, though, that is often overlooked is we do see AI that's being weaponized in sort of every part of the attack kill chain, which are the different steps that we describe a threat actor going through as they decide to attack an organization. So, for instance, one part of that kill chain is reconnaissance. So that's just gathering information about the company or the target that you're attacking. Well, as you probably have done yourself when you've looked up on AI, like information about a website or information about a company, it does act as sort of, a search engine on steroids and can produce a lot of that information very quickly for you in one shot when it used to take you maybe 3, 4, 10 Google searches to find the same information. So what we see is more the use of AI as personal capability uplift across the entire attack kill chain. And so when I say people miss this important point, the reason that we hear so much focus on like, oh, well, what about AI, generative AI, generating like polymorphic malware like on the fly? What people are missing about that is actually most intrusions today are fileless. They aren't being done with code. So the barrier to cybercrime was never generating a piece of code, was never like a highly effective polymorphic malware. It's debugging it, it's evading detection, it's maintaining the infrastructure, all the things that AI actually doesn't do for you anyway. Now, the places where AI is providing capability uplift, we've mentioned before where social engineering, right? It's extremely good at helping people craft social engineering scripts, at deep fakes, at this type of fraud type of scheme. And those have always been extremely effective ways of compromising an organization. That's why today, when we look at the majority of breaches that happen in an organization, like I said, a lot of them are fileless. They're not being done with some super advanced polymorphic malware. They're being done by a clever WhatsApp message to somebody's executive administrative assistant. So in that way, there is a lot of, sort of uplift that's happening. But, as it comes to like threat actor interest, right? And the way threat actors, coordinated, active threat actor groups are viewing AI and the places in the marketplaces, right? There's a lot of forums, there's a lot of socialization that these groups go through. And some of them we do have visibility into. And that was, a large part of the body of this research that was put out. There is an entire sort of hacker subculture that's very social, and that forums do run on reputation. There's a little bit of that we saw and reported on over a year and a half ago now, where of people like people on these forums, maybe these low-level script kiddies, threat actors who are trying to socialize and get into these groups are being made fun of, right? They're sometimes being called like a mama hacker, which basically is supposed to mean like the only one who thinks you're a hacker is your mama, right? And criminals, like we've actually seen on cybercrime criminal forums that these people are actually getting annoyed at AI slop on their forums, just like everyone else on the internet. There was a really great quote that I'll read. if I wanted to talk to an AI chatbot, there's so many websites for me to do so. I come to this forum for human interaction, right? So even these threat actors are really getting sick of AI. In a way, it's sort of disrupting a lot of the ecosystem that they've depended on. This socialization, the way that social engineering toolkits have been created over time. So I think it's really interesting about I think it's more about not threat actor groups developing super sophisticated AI systems that are going to be able to conduct end-to-end attacks completely and autonomously. It's more that we're seeing like individual threat actors who are established as part of these groups. They're just absorbing LLMs into their existing skills that they're bringing to the table, rather than sort of being transformed by them, the entire ecosystem being transformed by them. We have seen a few threat actor groups who have like very openly said, like, we used AI in order to create this script or create this piece of our malware that does like exfiltration, really very simple things, because we're not coders, right? So we have seen a few threat actor groups sort of like openly admit, but again, they're not using it sort of end to end in a complete automation to do things that their skill set wouldn't be able to. They're doing it to take a lot of shortcuts that sort of personal capability uplift. So, the picture here might look a little different. And I think that, the authors really flag this, the authors of this paper really flag this as a bigger story going over, is that we are thinking a lot about how threat actors might be using AI, and we're imagining a lot of ways that they could be creating sort of uniquely malicious AI capabilities. But really, the thing that we might be looking at and should be paying attention to as threat intelligence people is the disruption of the markets that's happening, right? Google's AI overviews, it was actually tanking social search engine optimization, SEO, schemes and fraud that was happening. Like, romance scammers are now having to compete in a space where there's like AI chatbots for, your AI girlfriend. They're competing with them now for like victim attention, right? And there's a huge now saturated freelance dev market that is pushing a lot of displaced coders toward fraud and get rich markets, right? We know that there is a link between populations that have a high amount of technical knowledge and tech saturation, right? Easy access to advanced tech skills and low economic job opportunity. That historically has always been when we've seen an explosion of cybercrime that happens in our ecosystem, right? A great example of this historically was Brazil, who invested a ton of money in education and technological infrastructure for their society. People did get highly skilled. Then there became a real scarcity of jobs. And so we saw a significant change towards a criminal ecosystem where people were forced to take those skills and use them in a criminal fashion in order to get money, right? So I think the headline here isn't so much, right, like AI supercharges script kiddies, right? It's more that there's sort of three major takeaways as a threat intelligence analyst that you really should be thinking about. The first is that AI helps the most the already skilled threat actors, right? The threat actors who the potential uplift that AI can provide is going to be the most uplift for threat actors who are already fairly capable, right? Guardrails are doing some real work as it comes around, right? That's where security, hygiene, and best practices as it applies to your security posture is really going to be a significant antidote to that. And that, these platform level shifts that we are seeing may matter actually more than the tools themselves, right? The way the ecosystem is being impacted because of AI impacting dev jobs, dev workers now having a high amount of technical skill and low economic opportunity, and they have these tool sets like and criminal ecosystems available to them, right? So, I think that the big takeaway, if you actually go into these forums and you spend a significant time reading them, like myself or Brian has, or people in this paper, is that the people who are actually the closest to using AI for crime, right? The people who are actually talking about those operations are some of the most skeptical voices in the room as it comes to AI's capabilities. And that's something we really need to pay attention to before we sort of spin ourselves out into like a movie scenario with a standalone complex and everything's the sky is falling. So, I think that's the big takeaway. Those are the sort of the big three things that if you were to walk away with this and sort of be able to speak to a leadership who might be coming to you and asking you about your opinion on this, that's going to be the most grounded in what we can observe of reality of these threat actor forums.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Brian. That puts a wrap on episode 4, and we'll be seeing you and chatting with you next episode. Thanks for listening to the Threat Intelligence Podcast hosted by Rachel James and Dr. Brian Nakayama from the GenAI Security Project. This podcast is produced by the GenAI Security Project with help from Rumrunner Media.